Okay, continuing on with our discussion of slavery in the Bible. Again, this section of the video series is focused on slavery in the New Testament. We're now going to turn our attention to the actual response we do find in the writings of the New Testament, especially Paul. The closest we get to this is Paul's injunction to free people is to do not become slaves of men, 1 Corinthians 7:23. The general anti-oppression and mistreatment ethic of the Old Testament would preclude slave trading. As I pointed out in our previous videos, slave trading would have been sinful and illegal under Mosaic law. This is strongly stated again by Paul. We also know that the law is made for the righteous. Let me re-quote it again. We also know that law is made not for the righteous, but for the lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and the sinful, the ungodly and the irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for adulterers, for perverts, for slave traders, and liars and perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 through 10. The biblical emphasis on kindness towards others, respect, and goodness would preclude abuses of slaves by masters, as well as respectful behavior towards others. This shows up in the household codes of Paul, in which the role enactments are required to be characterized by goodness and high ethics, which is the reason behind Ephesians 6:5, as well as Colossians 3:22, which parallel passages such as 1 Timothy 6:2 and Titus 2:9. The biblical emphasis on the creation in Christ via identification with his death would argue for any removal of many of the social, ethnic, and cultural barriers between people. Take a look at Galatians 3:28 and Colossians 3:11. It is important to point out that the slave class under the Roman Empire was despised by first century Judaism, which could have caused divisions in the first century church. This according to Everyman's Philemon, author Coleman, page 203. The biblical element of covenant loyalty would argue that both the master and the slave were held accountable for their sides of the relationship, to their responsibilities to one another, and the biblical motive of Christ as Lord over all elements created existence would argue that all relationships would be transformed by his lordship. This is definitely the case because Paul centers each aspect of the slave-owner relationship on their individual accountability to the Lord. Another reason behind Ephesians 6:5 as well as Colossians 3:22. As I've already stated, given the complex situation, we should not expect blanket commands to free the slaves. We might expect general encouragement away from a slave system. In fact, that is what we find. We do have statements that the church move away from general slave system orientation. Paul explicitly denounces slave trading, which would have restricted the supply of slaves to Christian households. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 through 10. I've already read that verse. Paul tells free people not to become slaves. 1 Corinthians 7:23. I've already read that verse. Paul tells slaves to become free if they can. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 21. And Paul encourages Philemon to free Onesimus in the epistle of Philemon, verses 16 and 21. And I'm going to talk more specifically about Philemon here in a little bit. But the historical situation was just too complex to issue a blanket statement of free them all or free all the slaves statement. Many slaves were still in infancy or childhood and rescued from infant exposure or abandonment. Many slaves were acquired in infancy or childhood with life caring being provided by the owner. Many slaves were aged or sick without means to live in freedom. The social relief systems of the empire would have been inadequate to care for these needy people. It's important to remember under the Roman Empire there was no welfare, there was no unemployment, there was very few means to care for these people. Later, the Emperor Julian would lament about this and that it is only the Christian community that provides welfare services to the needy of the world. There were known legal limits to freedom and probably others, some before the owner's death and some after. There was a growing body of legislation and intellectual support for the issues concerning the slave's conditions, and the trend lines were very favorable to the slave. Abuses of slaves were frowned upon and legislated against and deplored, as when Philemon the elder speaks of the cruelty of, I believe you say, polio, and the manner of execution of condemned slave criminals, or when Seneca describes the beating of a slave by a master for a simple sneeze. These were not accepted practices at the time, and it is simply false to assert that owners had complete authority over their slaves. Had Paul somehow was able to get the empire to free the slaves, the economic and social chaos would have been unimaginable. The sheer size of the slave population during the Roman Empire was immense. From a practical standpoint alone, it would have been impossible to have issued a unilateral emancipation command to the Christian community. Now, what I want to do in the next video is I want to turn my attention to the letter of Philemon, and I will do that now. Thank you very much.